Welcome back to Sunday with Michael Portillo. President Donald Trump has imposed a 10% tariff on British goods, but there's also a 25% impost on all automotive imports. Jaguar Land Rover will suspend shipments to the United States. European markets plummeted following retaliatory measures on the US from China, and $5 trillion has been wiped off Wall Street values. Joining me now to discuss the economic outlook and whether there's any chance of a US-UK trade deal is the founder of Competeri, who has advised both the United Kingdom Trade Secretary and the United States Trade Representative. I welcome Shanker Singham. Shanker, good to see you. You're in Washington, D.C. It's pretty early in the morning. Welcome to GB News.
Good morning.
One of the ideas that Donald Trump has is that he might raise quite a lot of money from tariffs, and that would enable him to cut taxes on the American people, and that would enable the American economy to thrive. What do you think of that proposition?
So I think when you look at the tariffs, there are three kind of strands. You've mentioned one of them, which is the tariffs for revenue purposes. There is also the early stage tariffs, which are tariffs for non-trade purposes. So things like the fentanyl issue in Canada and Mexico. Those tariffs tend to either never be imposed or they're very short-lived. The third strand is what you saw this week, which was unfair trade reciprocal tariffs, which is basically based on what other countries are doing to the US. And those, I think it's important to look at those three separately. Tariffs for revenue purposes, there is some thinking in the administration that this would be a good thing to do, that tariffs for their own sake, in other words, would be a good thing to do. We'd heard a lot less about that and much more about the unfair trade tariffs in the last week. Those big tariffs are not really about revenue. They're about disciplining other countries' practices. And, you know, in some senses, although obviously this has been massively criticized by economists all over the world, in some senses, Donald Trump is not wrong to identify on what he calls non-monetary barriers, which are these distortions and regulatory barriers and so forth. And the book that he waved around, which is the National Trade Estimate, is an inventory of foreign country barriers. Probably never been waved before from the presidential pulpit, but presidential podium, I should say, but has been produced every year for 40 years, and inventory of those issues.
Shanker, may I take you back to the taxation issue? It's just that it occurs to me that if it did work, that the United States could bring down the taxes on its businesses and its people, and the United States economy thrived, that could, in the longer term, be a benefit to the entire world. Now, with your economic mind, do you think that tariffs would enable the administration to cut taxes in the United States?
What is interesting about this is when you actually look at the numbers, the imposition of, let's say, a 5% tariff across the board would raise you potentially as much as 180 billion. And that is, you know, to give you some context, the entire corporate tax take in the US is about 500 billion. So these are serious numbers. They're hard for the administration to reject. And if the tariff is set low enough, you know, 4 or 5%, then it's unlikely to change supply chains hugely, and therefore one could argue it could survive, and they could actually lower taxes. And you know, very prominent free trade, free market economists like Art Laffer, for example, has essentially said, well, that's a deal I'd be willing to do. You know, a little bit of a tariff, your currency will appreciate a little bit, the other currencies will depreciate a little bit. You'll probably keep most of that supply chain in operation. But if you go above that kind of level, then you start to have sort of serious dislocating effects.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, we've both said that, you know, these tariffs have been pretty universally condemned outside the United States, but there must be a big constituency within the United States that thinks that it's the right thing to do to protect jobs, to protect factories, and indeed to retaliate against those whose trade practices are thought to be unfair. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, if you look at that book, the National Trade Estimate, which is this inventory of barriers all over the world, and it's not just tariffs, it's everything. It's everything you talked about. It's all the regulatory barriers, all the restrictions, all the subsidies, all the state-owned companies, all the lack of protection of intellectual property, and all of these things. And you go back 30 years and you look at the same book, you will find that the entries are virtually the same, or if anything, they've increased. Foreign countries have increased their barriers. And so Trump is essentially saying, look, we've tried over the last 30 or 40 years to lower these kinds of restrictions and distortions. We've had no success in this at all. Countries have continued to proliferate their distortions and their regulatory barriers that keep American products out. Because we did nothing about this, you look at the steel sector in the US. This is also true of the UK, by the way. The steel sector in both the UK and the US have been severely affected by Chinese state-owned companies and subsidies and so forth. And it's not just big developed countries, developed industries. The textile industry in Central America was essentially wiped out overnight because of the China textile companies. So he's making an argument here that we need to do something different. And I think what you also see with regard to the potential deals that he's willing to do, I think he's said to countries, you lower these distortions, you look at your entry in the National Trade Estimate, you lower some of these things, and you'll find that the tariff, it can come down. But what I think may be interesting here is he won't necessarily do this in the form of a deal without some sort of down payment. I mean, he will say, I don't believe you. For 30 years, we signed deals with people and nothing happened. So I don't believe you this time until you give me a down payment. So show me what you're actually going to do, and then we can start talking. I suspect that's where the administration will ultimately end up. But on the other hand, he will need to show some wins, especially as we get closer to the summer. You're a year out from the midterm elections. If the US consumer is starting to feel a bit of pain, he's going to need to be able to say, look, there are deals that I'm doing, that this is successful, that my policy here is causing countries to lower their barriers and distortions to US companies.
Shanker, that's brilliant analysis. It's very important, I think, not just to condemn, but also to understand what's going on. Shanker Singham from Washington, D.C.